تفضل دكتور أيهب.
Hello, everyone. I think it's time for us to get started. First of all, let me welcome you all to the second Arab Graduate Student Conference hosted by the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. Of course, and also I want to thank you for being an active participant in the conference, whether by attending here, being panelists or attendees, or through the social media. Today we have a very interesting session. Our speaker for today is Mohammad Al Asadi. Mohammad will talk about financing reconstruction in conflict-affected countries. Mohammad is a PhD candidate at the Institute of Development Research and Development Policy, Ruhr University, if I'm pronouncing it right. This is in German. He also holds an MA in Economic Change in the Arab region from Philipps University, German as well. His research interests include financing reconstruction in conflict-affected countries and informal financing for development. Mohammad, you have 20 to 25 minutes to present your paper. Then we have two discussants, 15 minutes for each. One of them is myself, and our second discussant is Anas Fassih. Then after that, this is about 1 hour of your presentation and two discussants. After that, we have 30 minutes of questions. So with regarding the 30 minutes of Q&A session, so if you have a question and you are a panelist, you can click raise hand and I will give you the mic. If you are attendees, you can write your question directly, okay, to me, and I will read it to the speaker. Also, the questions are welcome from social media participants. They can write their question directly to us, and we will read them to the speaker. Mohammad, without further ado, the floor is yours. You have 25 minutes from now.
Thank you, Dr. Ayhab, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. Let me first share my screen with you in order to be able to see my presentation. Good afternoon, everybody. I thank you for being here, attending my presentation. I'll present to you my PhD topic, which is related to financing recovery in conflict-affected countries, the financing resources, and fiscal sustainability. I will start with a brief introduction, mainly about the concept of armed conflict. Then I will present briefly the relationship between underdevelopment and conflict. I will move then to my research motivation and objective, then my theoretical framework, data set, and the methodology used. And in the end, I will present my empirical results and will conclude with a conclusion. I would like to start my presentation by showing you this interactive map here, which is developed by Uppsala University Conflict Data Program. The map shows the active conflicts around the world during 2019. One can easily notice that the most severe conflicts were concentrated in the MENA region, and particularly in Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, Libya, and Yemen. According to this data program, there were 32 countries experiencing internal conflict situation in 2019. And according to the World Bank, around 500 million people were living in countries where development outcomes are affected by conflict, fragility, or violence. In addition, around 17% of the global poor were living in conflict-affected situations, and this number is expected to increase to 46% by 2030. Moreover, around 80% of all humanitarian needs are driven by conflicts, according also to the World Bank. The Institute of Economics and Peace estimated the global economic loss in 2015 at around $13.6 trillion. Moving to the relationship between underdevelopment and conflict, economists in general tend to consider a mutually reinforcing relationship between underdevelopment and conflict. So on the one hand, poor development outcomes stimulate the fertile environment for the conflicts to break out. Paul Collier and Anke Hoffler were among the pioneer scholars in this regard. In a series of studies, they found that low national income and a previous history of conflict, in addition to the low diversification of the economy and the reliance on primary commodity export, are factors that increase the risk of conflict. Other scholars found that, such as Miguel et al., found that the weak or low economic growth is associated with high conflict risk. Some scholars argue that it is the how growth is distributed and the type of economic growth that is important for defining the conflict risk, or what is usually defined as horizontal inequality, which is the inequality between groups of populations and not between individuals themselves. Scholars of other disciplines argue that it is not only argue that do not fully agree with the economist's perspective, and they argue that identity and factors such as identity, nationalism, and regional dynamics also affect the conflict risk. And the development-related factors are not representative in this regard. Moving to the opposite direction of the relationship, which is from conflict to development, this area of research were extensively researched in the literature. Many researchers found that among the consequences of armed conflicts are the loss of human lives, which is one of the most serious impact of armed conflicts. According to the Geneva Declaration on Armed Violence and Development, around 70,000 people were losing their lives annually between 2007 and 2012 due to armed conflicts. Another serious impact of conflicts is the refuge and the displacement. And according to the UNHCR, around 65 million people were displaced until 2015 due to violence or conflicts or the violation of human rights. Another serious impact of armed conflicts is the wide destruction of assets, capitals, infrastructure, and even institutions. The combination of these three factors are translated into loss of income. According to Collier, a 7-year typical conflict leads to a loss of 60% of pre-conflict GDP on average. Other scholars argue that conflict-affected countries lag behind with regard to the achievement of Millennium Development Goals due to the conflicts. And this is particularly true with regard to poverty reduction, the infant mortality rate, and the access to potable water. So these consequences leave countries affected by conflict fragile even long after the conclusion of the conflict. And by fragility, we mean the government unwillingness or inability to provide basic services in the areas of security, the rule of law, and basic services. Usually, fragile countries are characterized by institutional weakness or even failure. Looking at the Fragile States Index, which is developed by the Fund for Peace, we can notice that 75% of the 40 most fragile countries are either post-conflict countries or countries that are affected by conflict. In the same vein, the World Bank publishes annually the harmonized list of fragile situations, where the country policy and institutional assessment, the CPIA, forms the core determinants of the inclusion in this list. 3 out of 16 of the CPIA sub-indicators are directly related to fiscal policy and debt policy. So in other words, the fiscal fragility is a significant component of state fragility. Lebanon is a prominent example of countries that are affected by conflict and then remain fragile even long after the conclusion of the conflict. The conflict in Lebanon ended in 1989. During the first post-conflict decade, the debt stock as a percentage of GNI was manageable, was still sustainable. But in the following decades, this ratio deteriorated significantly. And in addition, the total debt service as also a percentage of GNI followed a similar trend. During the last few years, the debt stocks were totally unsustainable and went out of control. And we all saw the explosion last week in Beirut, and one component of the state fragility in Lebanon is the fiscal fragility. Against this background, my research focuses on the fiscal sustainability in conflict-affected countries, and I try to answer the main research question about the determinants of fiscal sustainability in conflict-affected countries. The data set that I use is primary. Depends on the Uppsala University Conflict Data Program. It includes 62 developing countries between the period 1970 to 2017. 35 of the countries are post-conflict countries, 17 are conflict countries, and 21 are non-conflict countries. The sum of these countries do not add up to 62 because some countries were considered both post-conflict and conflict countries. I will start first my theoretical framework by defining or by presenting to you the concept of fiscal sustainability. Usually, the concept of fiscal sustainability is close to the concept of solvency. One definition for fiscal sustainability is the government's ability to service its debt obligations without explicitly defaulting on them. Another definition is the government's ability to be solvent without a change in the prevailing course of fiscal policy. A definition that is more close to neoclassical thought is relates the sustainable debt position to the position that allows the economy to converge to its steady state. There are also several approaches for calculating the fiscal sustainability. I use in my study the primary fiscal gap for three main reasons. First, it is a widely used indicator. It is particularly used by the World Bank, the European Commission, and the IMF. In addition, it does not require complex inputs, which is a very important factor when we are researching conflict-affected countries where the data availability is an issue. The third reason is that it generates reliable results according to some scholars. Basically, the primary fiscal gap calculates the difference between the actual primary balance, which is calculated by revenues minus expenditure, and the primary balance that is required to stabilize the debt to GDP ratio, or what is called a sustainable primary balance. So the primary fiscal gap here is calculated by actual primary surplus minus the sustainable primary balance, which in turn is calculated as the difference between real interest rate and growth rate multiplied by the debt ratio in the previous period. This equation explains how we calculate the primary fiscal gap. Positive values of primary fiscal gaps indicate that the fiscal position of the state is sustainable, because in this case, the actual surplus exceeds the required one for the government to remain solvent. While on the opposite, if the primary fiscal gap have a negative value, then the primary fiscal gap is unsustainable, indicates unsustainable fiscal position. Because in this case, the actual surplus is below the required one for the position to be sustainable. The difference between the real interest rate and the growth rate plays a central role in defining the sustainability stance of the state. When this difference is positive, then the government is required to maintain a budget surplus. And this is in order to offset the upward pressure in the debt to GDP ratio. Because in this case, when the interest rate is greater than the growth rate, then in this case, the debt is growing in a faster pace compared with the growth of the size of the economy. While in the opposite case, when this difference is negative, then in this case, the interest rate is lower than the growth rate, which indicates a growth of the debt that is slower than the growth of the size of the economy. My study focuses on external debt levels because it is the dominant part of the debt composition in conflict-affected countries. In this case, the interest rate is largely determined by donors. Hence, the country growth rate is the key significant factor affecting fiscal sustainability in this model. Assuming a solo growth model where the growth rate is translated into capital accumulation, growth of workforce, and solo residual, we are particularly interested in factors that are embedded in solo residual and that affect the fiscal sustainability in conflict-affected countries. Based on this, the sustainability indicator of the state is a function of two main factors. First, a set of factors that are related to solo residual, and second, a set of factors that are that represent the control variables. In a panel setting, the explicit form of our model looks in the following way. The dependent variable is the sustainability indicator, which is calculated based on the primary fiscal gap, as we already illustrated. And the independent variables are variables representing the foreign aid, the FDI, the resource rent, trade, inflation, country status, conflict or post-conflict or non-conflict, and the military expenditure, in addition to gross fixed capital formation, in the quadratic form as well, and the population growth. These are the variables. I will test three forms of foreign aid: the net ODA, and the aid for production sectors, in addition to ODA that is channeled via the public budget. For FDI, I will use the net inflows of FDI as a percentage of GDP. For resource rent, also the natural resources rent as a percentage of GDP. Military expenditure, gross fixed capital formation, trade balance also as a percentage of GDP. The inflation is represented by the GDP deflator, and the population growth will be used as a proxy for the workforce growth, because for workforce data, I was not able to find data with a period that is particularly prior to 1990. In addition, a binary variable of the country status will be used. Before performing the regression test, I performed a set of pre- and post-regression tests. First, I checked the existence of outliers in the dependent variable. I was able to find three observations that have extreme values. I eliminated these variables, these observations, in order not to distort the regression results. Then I checked for the panel stationarity. I conducted Fisher-type unit root test with a log length of 3 years. The results show that we should reject the hypothesis that all panels have unit roots. Then at least one panel is stationary. I also checked the existence of heteroscedastic variances of the error terms in the model. The results show that our model suffers from heteroscedasticity. Therefore, I will use robust standard errors that are cluster-based. I also performed Hausman test to check whether the fixed effect or the random effect model is preferred. The results show that the fixed effect model is preferred over the random effect model, and this was expected because most of the independent or all the independent variables are time variant variables. I also performed the multivariable Ramsey reset test in order to check the model specifications. We reject the null hypothesis that the model has no omitted variables. So our model suffered from omitted variables. To solve this problem, I included the variable of the lagged value of the dependent variable in order to solve the endogeneity problem. After this inclusion, we were unable to reject the null hypothesis. So at the end, I estimated the model coefficients. I first estimated the proposed model on post-conflict countries. Then I compared the post-conflict countries with the whole sample, then with conflict countries, and at the end with non-conflict countries. The final results are shown in the following table. Approximately all independent variables in our model for the post-conflict group showed a significant impact on fiscal sustainability. The FDI, the resource rent, the military expenditure, and as expected with negative value, because it is an expenditure that is expected to affect the sustainability in a negative way. The lagged value of the dependent variable, the trade balance also. The only variable that did not show a significant impact on sustainability is the population growth. In addition, gross fixed capital formation showed a significant coefficient. The impact of the gross fixed capital formation turned negative after a specific level. In addition, the lagged value of the aid for production sectors is the one that showed significant impact on fiscal sustainability. Compared to other groups, there are significant differences with the coefficients. For instance, with regard to conflict countries, only three variables showed significant impacts. These are resource rent, inflation, and the trade balance. With regard to non-conflict countries, 4 variables showed significant impact on fiscal sustainability. These are inflation, lagged value of the dependent variable, the population growth, and the ODA that is channeled via the public budget. As a conclusion, the study concludes that the FDI has a significant positive impact on enhancing the sustainability of fiscal position in conflict affected by countries. In addition, maintaining a minimum trade deficit support the fiscal sustainability. And as expected, the abundance of natural resources in post-conflict phase plays a significant role in supporting the fiscal position. High inflation rate could have a positive impact on fiscal sustainability, but only up to a specific level, and this is via the seigniorage channel. Military expenditure also, as expected, was negatively associated with fiscal sustainability. One of the most important conclusion of my thesis was that donor countries, to support conflict-affected countries, aid has to be directed towards supporting the productive sector in agriculture, manufacturing, and trade. Thanks for your hearing and for your presentation.
Thank you, Muhammad. Thank you very much for this interesting topic and interesting presentation. Right now, I will have to discuss your paper for around 15 minutes. Just give me a minute to share my slides. I hope you can see my screen. Give me a thumb up if you can see it, Muhammad. Okay. So I'll be talking for around 10 to 15 minutes. So that's around at 3:40. I will stop. and then we move to our next discussant. So, first of all, thank you. This is a great presentation. The topic is very timely and important, especially for our region. Let me just give the audience summary of the paper, or my understanding of what this paper is trying to do, just to wrap things and to be in the same page. So to me, this is a paper that attempts or try to empirically examine the main economic factors that help conflict or post-conflict countries sustaining their fiscal stand or public debt, if you wish. We all know this is a very important topic. As the speaker mentioned, that in the region there are many countries that are currently under ongoing conflict, or they're considered post-conflict countries, and it's important for them to maintain their fiscal stance, right? Because we know budgets, government budget debits are very important in determining the future course of the future economic course of any country. Not to mention the post-conflict countries, which really needs a lot of reconstruction and building, and hence borrowing as well. To me, also, this is the author. I think the author did a great job in explaining the theories that links public debts, fiscal stance, fiscal sustainability, and conflict. I think it's a very rich paper in this regard. And to me also, it's very important for us to understand the factors, the variables that might affect the fiscal sustainability in post-conflict countries, because this will have a very important implication for economic policies and for post-conflict recovery. So how the author answers this question, specifically the main factors that might impact physical sustainability in post-conflict countries, the authors use panel data, which is many countries over some period of time. The author, as he mentioned, there is 69 developing countries, and the time series spans, we have a time series from 1970 to 2017. So what the author does in the version, at least I have, maybe there's some minor changes between what you presented and the version of the paper that I have. So the countries were divided into 3 groups: non-conflict countries, ongoing conflict countries, and post-conflict countries. And then the researcher analyze or run a panel regression on each group separately to figure out the most important factors that might contribute to physical sustainability in each group. So what the results are, so I'll give you a quick review of the paper's result. It seems for post-conflict countries, FDI, directed aid, and trade balance have positive association with physical sustainability. So it's a good thing to have, to attract a lot of FDI, to have directed aid, and to have trade balance if you want to secure a good physical stance and you want to minimize your budget deficit. Of course, as the author said, military expenditure seems to have negative effect on physical sustainability. For the conflict group, the results seem to me similar. Again, FDI, ODA, or which is I call directed aid, and trade balance also have positive effect. And in the version I have, the remittances seem to have negative impact, which is also puzzling in this case. What about non-conflict countries? The analysis tells us that, again, exports and aid, foreign aid, also have a positive effect on physical sustainability. These are quickly the main results of the paper. Now I go to my comments. I hope the comments help you improving your paper. Of course, we can discuss them later if you want. Okay. So first of all, let me say this is a well-written paper. Actually, I really enjoyed reading it. Thank you for having me discussing your paper. I think the literature review in the paper is very comprehensive and complete. And really, I learned a lot by going through the literature review in the paper. There is a rich discussion of the various theories of physical sustainability and conflict. This was really very nice of you to do, because this has given us a clear picture about the literature and how we link physical sustainability to conflict. I also believe that the author did a great job in discussing the relevance and importance of physical sustainability in conflict and post-conflict countries. And the author just gave us a very nice presentation why we should care about physical sustainability and budget and debts in case of post-conflict countries. Also, the author discusses thoroughly the measures of physical sustainability in the literature. As he mentioned, there are many ways to measure physical sustainability. He discussed them all, and also he justified his choice of primary surplus indicator. And this also was very nice to do in the paper. So right now I have some comments. Mainly my comments are on the empirical section. I apologize if sometimes my comments are technical, but the whole point of these comments is to improve the paper a bit. So first of all, the descriptive statistics were missing in the paper. I think this is, you have to add the descriptive statistics. Okay. Why you need to do that? Because this will give us a better idea about the data. Okay. So also, I'd like to see how much variation in physical sustainability over time and across country. Does this variable vary over time across country? If there is no variation in FS, physical sustainability over time, so this will raise some flags in with regard to your empirical model. So you have to add these. Okay. So also I advise you to do descriptive statistics for the whole sample and for each group separately as well. Okay. Another, this is mainly a question. It wasn't clear to me how you divide countries into three groups. So he said, okay, we have conflict, we have non-conflict, we have post-conflict. So I gave you example, which is I cannot answer because it wasn't explained in the paper. Suppose a country was a post-conflict in 1980, and after that it became a non-conflict. How do you categorize this country? Will you consider it a conflict, a non-conflict or a post-conflict? So this is what's in green. What kind of sample you use in each group wasn't very clear to me. So equation in base 23, and here I have to admit, seems you changed that equation a bit, but I think like it's a bit confusing. No, it's still, this still holds even for the new version. Because in that equation, the equation just presented, the empirical model equation, you include the country status, which is a binary variable, you say. But actually you don't. When you run the regression, the empirical analysis, you don't do that. You just divide the countries into three countries. So you need to rewrite this because this is confusing. Unless you really include this variable, so this should not be in the equation. Sorry, this should not be in the equation. Wait a minute. Do you see? Okay, you still see my screen, right? Yeah. Sorry for that. So yes, this should not be included because you didn't include this binary variable, which is also not binary, by the way, because it takes three values, 0, 1, 2. So you cannot call it binary as well. Okay. So this is also another, I would say, maybe an issue in the paper, that the variables in the equation do not match with the variables reported in the table. So in the empirical model, in the discussion, when you discuss your model, you say, I want to control for variables A, B, C, D. But then in the table, we suddenly see new variables that you never talked about, okay? Or at least they don't match. Make sure they perfectly match. Like whatever you say, these are the variables, these are the variables that you should use in your actual regression, right? So, and I was a little bit confused because, you know, you talked about export as one of the independent variables in your model, but then you, in your regression analysis, you use a trade balance, not exports. And as we know, those are completely different variables, right? So at least you need to make yourself clear, whether you use export or trade balance, say, I'm using this. But instead, you discuss export and then you use trade balance. So this, I'm not sure, maybe you change this for comment, which is about the lag dependent variable, the lagged physical sustainability variable. So in the paper, you included this as independent variable as well. If you do this, you cannot use banner regression anymore. You have to use GMM. Okay, so you have to be very careful with this point. if you want to add the lagged dependent variable as independent variable as well, so the panel regression will be biased, and you are advised to use GMM model. So this point, actually, and I wish you could address this, because I was troubled by it, because I saw different empirical specification for each group. So for both conflict countries, you control, your dependent variables are different from the conflict countries. It's also different from the independent variables for non-conflict countries. So you use different specifications, empirical specific in each model. For example, you control for trade balance for, if I remember correctly, for post-conflict, but you control for exports for the conflict groups. So you use different variables each time. Because you're doing this, it becomes very hard for me to compare the results across the groups, because you use different models in each one. So this is something you need to work on. You need to have the same set of independent variables for all groups. This should be your main model, and then if you want to add some extension, you start adding extensions. Okay, so this is also important, which also you need a lot for robustness check, which was kind of missing in the paper. So this is also, I'd like to see more discussion about causality and correlation. So how do you interpret your results? Is it correlation or causation? And if it's causation, why you think it's causation? And if it's not causation, you have to. So we need a big discussion about this, because this really what makes your paper much stronger, right? Because I can give you many reasons why the result should be seen as correlation or causation. And this is not what we want. So you have to defend your position in terms of this. Also, you need to quantify results, and this means you need to give meaning to the numbers in the table, right? So it's not just saying it's significant or insignificant. Give me magnitude, how large it is, right? So you can give example of FDI increases by 1%, the physical sustainability increases by 2%, so on. So you have to quantify the results and give meaning, make numbers alive. Okay. To me, the last point is the most important point, because I think this is at the heart of your paper and your contribution. You have to discuss the main insight of your results. What do I mean by that? So here I mean, are the factors affecting conflict at both post-conflict countries, affecting the physical sustainability for conflict and post-conflict countries, different from the non-conflict countries? And if they are different, you have to mention why. Okay? So otherwise, your study is just really analyzing factors that contributing to physical sustainability. And this has been done hundreds of times. So your contribution is no, you want to show that these factors might differ across countries based on whether they are in conflict right now or post-conflict. I haven't seen a lot of this kind of discussion. For example, a variable X impacts physical sustainability in post-conflict countries, while the same variable does not impact it in the non-conflict countries. And you need to justify why. You need a theory. You need to discuss it because this is really actually your contribution, and most of your effort should be here for this point, right? Otherwise, it's a very nice paper. I hope the comments are helpful, and I hope you might find them useful in improving your paper. And I wish you best of luck. That's it for me. So now we will move to our next discussant. Just give me a minute. So Anas Fassih will be discussing the paper as well. Anas, are you with us? Can you hear me? Can you unmute yourself? Or you want me to unmute you?
No, I can unmute.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Anas, thank you for being with us today as discussant and participant as well. You have 15 minutes if you wish to discuss the paper. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dr. Saad. And I'm just going to be very brief. And thanks, Mohammad, for presenting. I really got the pleasure to listen to your presentation. First of all, I have to say that I'm really humbled to say that I'm not an expert in finance. Finance is beyond my area of interest. My home field is international relations and comparative politics in the Department of Political Science. So what I really do is like when I was reading the paper talking about fiscal, like sustainability, debt, all this kind of things does not make sense to me. It does. I look at it from a methodological perspective. It does ring the bell. But when I kind of try to understand the kind of the definitions, and it's something that is beyond the orbit of my knowledge. Also, another thing that I'm not a quant guy. Like I'm really my doctoral dissertation is largely informed by qualitative methodologies, drawing basically on discourse analysis, interviews, and causation from like a qualitative perspective. So I have to say I'm gonna give some humble comments, basically based on my reading, and also based on my expertise. So I will start with since conflict, you are talking about conflict. There is a cross between your paper and my research interest in talking about states, like post-conflict states, post-conflict building, and state building, and also importantly, like states that are actually undergoing conflict. I was intrigued by. First of all, I really enjoyed the reading the paper. There is a lot of definitions. This is something that was really important. Like it's very comprehensive in terms of like defining the basic and key concepts, theories about fiscal sustainability and debt and post-conflict and conflict states. But I saw something there, like how did you categorize your choices of conflict, post-conflict states? How do you measure, other than drawing on the database from Uppsala Peace Studies Institute? So how do you know, like, this is like for me, like, reading through the paper, I believe like in a large project like this, there has to be some sort of definition of what would be, what are the characteristics of a conflict state, a state undergoing conflict, and a post-conflict state, other than drawing on a Uppsala Institute database. Basically, like these are exactly what they identify as conflict states. And this is remark number one. Remark number two is like the period of 1970 to 2017, and then again, like revisiting the post-conflict and conflict states. I think like the conflict dynamics have changed exponentially since 1970 until now. In 1970, we had the Cold War, and then the bipolar, like the conflict back then was actually between two blocks, and then that block was primarily ideological, that translated into both the United States and also the Soviet Union trying to generate support and then attract the member countries to join one of the camps. But whereas nowadays, like we're like 2000 started from 2003, we have a different dynamics of conflict. We kind of shifted from interstate conflict in conflict studies, interstate conflict to intrastate conflict. So conflicts between states to conflicts internal, like inside the state, through civil wars, through like that is because of grievances, because of identity, because of a lot of problems, like because of also the rise of Islamism and jihadism. And so this kind of, maybe there has to be an explanation of conflict, like conflict back then and conflict now, and then how this fiscal responsibility manifests itself, fiscal sustainability manifests itself. How does it change in both conflict dynamics, in both eras? In talking about the literature of conflict and underdevelopment, like there is this literature that you probably know it basically. So, but just there is a large swath of literature on the security development nexus in political science and conflict studies. So the security development nexus basically says, without security we cannot have development, and without development we cannot have security. So they go hand in hand, and then they go together. So security development nexus in fragile states. So fragile states and security development nexus, there is a large literature there. So maybe if you can have a read about that, and then maybe you can include some citations from there, that would definitely be very, very useful. Yeah, my last comment probably is on the discussion side of your paper, just from a methodological perspective. I've been reading through your paper, traveling through definitions, explaining the variables, and then you only introduce your empirical results in page 24. So page 24, 25, 26, conclusion. So 3 pages, then it ends. And then you end the paper with diagrams here. So for me, that's, I mean, these diagrams, I like descriptively, I read them, they make some time sense, but I strongly believe there should be some sort of discussion explaining to us, like, and I agree with Dr. Ayhab, exactly what Dr. Ayhab said, like, ending like a paper with diagrams. I think there has to be some sort of section discussing this, and also discussing how do they relate to each other, and also just a kind of discussion to explain to the reader, at the same time lay the ground for your conclusion. And also importantly, maybe also like you conducted the study on the developing world, like maybe some sort of recommendation, how would these findings have been applied, these findings, the studies on this world has found this, how do you envision the application of the study elsewhere? What would be the finding like? Maybe the kind of generating or kind of precipitating future research, which is very, very important research. I don't know, but thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. And I'm humbled to read the paper beyond my expertise. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Anas. Actually, we have around 40 minutes. So I'd first, before start getting questions, I'd like to give the floor for Mahmoud if he has anything to add or to reply to our comments before we start taking questions from the attendees or panelists.
Thank you, Dr. Ayhab. Thank you, Anas. Indeed, thanks for these useful comments. Indeed, these are the inputs that I was waiting for. I have a few comments with regard to, for instance, with regard to the variables and how they differ between the groups, the subgroups. In the latest version of my study, maybe if I was able to share my screen again with you, I can show you. I somehow managed to unify the variables that are tested between the 3 groups. Only one variable that differs, which is the variable related to foreign aid, because I found that foreign aid has different impacts on the 3 subgroups, and different variables of aid. For instance, in the conflict-affected countries, or in post-conflict countries, the aid for production sectors was significant, while in the conflict countries, the general aid. In the non-conflict countries, the aid that is channeled via the public budget. So this is the only variable that it changes between the 3 groups in my latest version of the paper. The second point, this answers maybe the export. If you notice, Dr. Ayhab, the export is not anymore anymore included in the result table of my recent paper, recent version of the paper. Yes, I agree with you with regard to the GMM, the use of the GMM. If I use the lagged value of the dependent variable, I also had this input from other experts. I have also a comment with regard to the criteria upon which I differentiate between the subgroups. Basically, I used the criteria used in the Uppsala University conflict data program, but I did not took it as it is, so I modified it. It is a little bit complicated, but I explained it in the latest version of my paper. But I was really reluctant to include it in the presentation, because it is somehow complicated. It does not only rely on the input of the Uppsala University conflict data program, but it also takes into consideration the economic aspect of the conflict, because in the data program, in the Uppsala University data program, they do not consider economic aspect in their categorization of conflict countries. With regard to the this is with regard to definitions of conflict state. Yes, so with regard to discussion, I also agree with you. Yes, and also in the latest version of my paper, I will work on extending the discussion part further. I would also consider talking a little bit about future research and potential research in this regard. Thank you for all the inputs. Really, most of them are useful for me. Thanks.
Thank you, Mohammed. We have a question from Dr. Sultan Barakat. Dr. Sultan, go ahead.
Hi, Mohammed. First of all, thank you very much. I think it's a very good paper and extremely insightful. It's not a question as much as maybe a recommendation towards your conclusion and moving forward. One potential improvements, I think, would be to look more qualitatively into the context in which those states have emerged out of conflict. The way you've categorized, and I see both reviewers have really picked on that you categorized using quantitative approaches, that these are just into conflict, post-conflict, etc., numbers, and this can be confusing. What really happens in a lot of these contexts is the physical arrangement is not the results, it's not directly linked just to the fact that there is conflict or absence of conflict. It depends a lot on the type of state that is being set up in the aftermath of conflict. So the political settlement reached draws the parameters for the financial arrangement in that country. And from it can give or subtract from the physical sustainability of that particular context. Many countries that reach an agreement that depends on sharing power, they end up unfortunately sharing the coffers of the state. And they do not actually build physical sustainability. They see it as a war gift to be shared. And a lot of these difficulties are not related to the fact that they're out of conflict. They're related to the nature of the conflict that emerges, or the nature of the government that emerges based on the political settlement. Of course, I'm not suggesting that you should undo everything you've done, but maybe as you reach your conclusion, this would be one of those conclusions that links to where you emphasize the need for better understanding of the context. That a government like Lebanon post-conflict differs very much from Rwanda post-conflict, both in terms of its efficiency, the ethos they work towards, the ethics they observe, the way they invest, and so on. And the second factor, which has to do with the donors, I think their emphasis in the post-conflict era on liberal economics is often premature. It comes at the expense of longer-term physical sustainability. They never seen a context where they've allowed the country to limit import into the country in order to encourage the local production of any item. Often by the end of war, it's also seen as a way to liberate the economy and to get them to import everything. And this is what we saw in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Afghanistan, lots of other places. They find it almost impossible to keep the dollars in the country. And linked to that is the dollars that's coming from those donor countries. They themselves get siphoned off very early on, and they pay for their consultants, their advisors, their products, and so on. So what really is retained in country is very small percentage of the overall money that is put in those countries. And I have statistic that shows roughly in Afghanistan, it's 40% of what the world brings into Afghanistan is spent in Afghanistan. 60% of the aid spent before it even reached the country. So I think those are maybe areas for further investigation, further research, and would be great if your overall quantitative, quick look that you've presented can then recommend more detailed studies, which takes into consideration the nature of state as much as the end of conflict or otherwise. But other than that, I don't have anything to add. I think it's fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Barakat. I'm not sure, Mohammad, if you want to comment on this or reply.
Yeah, I think I consider myself lucky to have an input from Dr. Sultan. Thanks for all your emails. I mean, with all your considerable contributions to the post-conflict studies. Yes, I agree with you. I do agree with you for the 2 points. But as you said, maybe I was, with regard to the first point particularly, I tried to incorporate a variable that captured the institutional position of the country in post-conflict phase. But I was not successful in this regard, and mainly because of the lack of data, of available data. Frankly speaking, the available data in conflict and post-conflict settings is a challenge. And I tried to compensate on this issue by including the lagged value of the independent variable. And this is one main reason why I included the lagged value of the dependent variable in the independent variables, because I assume that since institutions are improving slowly, whether in post-conflict or in the normal situations, then the lagged value of the dependent variable will be able to capture this impact. I hope in the future I will be able to capture to find an indicator that can reflect the institutional changes in post-conflict countries. Maybe this would be optimal.
Good luck.
Thank you. Dr. Ayhab, we can't hear you. Can you unmute yourself?
Okay, just a quick comment. I like very much Dr. Sultan comment about the short-term and long-term impact of foreign aid. Actually, in this, you can investigate this using the data by extending the panel data set. Like, you say whether receiving some aid today will impact physical sustainability next year. And also you can examine whether this will impact physical sustainability 10 years from now in the same way or differently. This can be done empirically. I think this is a very good point, actually. So you start distinguishing between short-term and long-term impact of this physical foreign aid. Okay, I think we have one more question. We have a question from Yazid Zahdan. Yazid, if you can hear me.
Hi, I'm Mohammad. Thank you very much for.
Go ahead, man. Thank you.
Mohammad, my comments will be mainly based on a different understanding of development. I know that you have been so much influenced by the neoclassical approach to development, which is fine, but still very problematic, because there are many critical theories basically that problematize the notion of development and the intervention of developers, in these post-conflict areas of regions. So my first comment is that when we just look at all these variables and thinking that they will basically bring some change in these post-conflict countries simply because of these development interventions, is very problematic, because you do not take into account all other factors, the social factors, the institutional factors, the cultural factors that play a lot in shaping the type of institutions, the type of reaction, the type of policies that will be formed in the post-conflict areas in particular. Take, for instance, the case of Palestine, which is still, in my opinion, conflict and post-conflict at the same time, depending on how you look at it. In that regard, I'm saying that there is a problem when we just think of these interventions, surgical interventions that would just make sure that if this happens, then this will happen, or when there is this, there is a correlation with this. So like the liberal peace will create probably, coexistence between the Palestinians and the Israelis simply because of the economic prosperity that we presume will be created between the two sides. This is one example, which is in fact not happening. In addition to that, the role of agency, in this whole analysis is never taken into account, because when you look at the models, you just think of the models as static. Presumably, this is an equilibrium that will eventually settle all the issues in these post-conflict or conflict areas, which is not the fact. I mean, because that anything could happen. In addition to that, there are other factors that could also play. Not only the political, when you mentioned, the conflict areas from the political, I can't remember the other basically factors that you also said that there are contributing to our understanding of why there is a conflict. I would also think of other factors on the side, like even environmental factors, ecological factors in that regard, because we have now been witnessing the rise of conflicts in the world because of environmental issues. But this is not my point, but I'm just pointing out this crucial issue. When it comes to the fiscal, sustainability, I'm thinking of how all these factors, even if I'm taking the neoclassical understanding of development, but still, if I'm talking about the fiscal sustainability, I still have a problem when looking at the case of Lebanon, for instance, when we know that the case of, in this case, it's about corruption. And corruption is very much linked to all these different parties with different confessions, with different religious affiliations, with different political powers sharing. And so, I mean, no matter what happens, I mean, look at the summits that were held, I mean, or have been held in Paris, trying to push the Lebanese government to carry out the reforms, but they never listened to the recommendations of the French between two brackets. So in that regard, still, if you have the political will not to actually go on with the reforms, you can still not go on with the reforms. And this is exactly what has brought to the Lebanese a catastrophe, in the middle of Beirut. So how would you still think of fiscal sustainability from only one variable or two variables that will eventually bring about this aspired objective of sustainability in the fiscal area? So this is a very sensitive issue that cannot be actually addressed from a neoclassical perspective.
Thank you.
And this is my final point, The why is a very crucial point that has been raised. So think about it. The why cannot be just explained through numbers. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. Mohammad?
Yeah, may I? Thanks for your comments. I agree with you to a large degree, but it is, first of all, I will discuss the comment from 2 points of view. First of all, it is beyond the research scope to include factors that are outside the economic theory. So, first of all, there is no ready-made model in economics for linking fiscal sustainability to its determinant factors. So I had the challenge to develop this model, and adding factors that are outside the economic or the development field would have put a much larger challenge on the way the study develops. So this is one point. point. In another point, some of the factors that I looked at already take into consideration some of the non-economic factors. For instance, you talked about corruption. Yes, I do agree with you. And with the case of Lebanon, I do agree with you, fully agree with you that corruption, the political dynamics, the sectarian division in Lebanon, they all played a role in the fiscal fragility of the country. But some of these factors can be observed from some factors that I included in the model, such as the military expenditure, for instance. The military expenditure is usually high in post-conflict countries, but it is negative impact on fiscal sustainability. I think this indicates some of the contribution of corruption into the fiscal fragility in the country. FDI could also be considered in the same way, because if the country is corrupt, then only a few FDI projects will head to it. So some of these factors, I'm not saying that all of these factors can be captured in an economic model, but at least some of them. And maybe this is an opportunity for future research, interdisciplinary research that maybe can be conducted that can combine economic and non-economic factors in this regard.
Thank you, Mohammad. Dr. Hamid. Dr. Hamid, we can hear you. Unmute yourself if you wish. No, you're still muted. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mohammad, and also thank you for the brilliant discussion by Dr. Ayhab. One thing that I will just bring it up in terms of the way you structure your dependent variable. When you call it this fiscal sustainability, it could be either you look at the debt ratio to the GDP, that will tell us if it's exceeding certain threshold, we said sustainable versus non-sustainable. The argument that you are using it, that is the rate of return or interest rate minus a growth rate. Actually, if we look for the Thomas Piketty's argument, it's clearly saying that is when the interest rate is exceeding the GDP growth, it doesn't mean sustainable, it means capital accumulation, and you see that is it creates an inequality. So there is an inequality factor embedded over there. So this is one of the factors that will determine if the economy is equal or unequal. I wish you put some sort of a measure of inequality there in the discussion. The other part that is also, I feel a little bit concerned about it, about the military expenditure and the rent and the resources rent. And I think there is so much literature that's written on that argument about the military expenditure and the natural resources rent in the Middle East and etc. It's showing that these variables are quite endogenous in its structure. Okay, so because the countries that have a higher resources rent also have a tendency to spend more on the military expenditure. So clearly you have that endogenous, and this will take you to the discussion brought in by Dr. Ayhab, that is you need to go and estimate the GMM model. So because you don't have too many, you have too many endogenous variables over there, and you don't have enough sufficient instrument. So it is likely, and it makes a lot of sense to go and run the GMM model. What you are running now is not the GMM, you are running the dynamic panel, because you are taking the dependent variable and lag it over there. You can lag it 1 period, 2 period, depends. So from that argument, go and run and also the Granger causality test is very important. Once you have so many endogenous variable, to see this causal relation, is it one way or by, whether it is two-way or one way. So I think it might be worth it to pay attention to that in terms of your model. But overall, I think it's a great opportunity, and it's a nicer paper that had a lot of potential. And the last point is, don't break your variable into the post, pre, and no conflict. Because, as I have raised it earlier, the country is a dynamic. 1 year is going to be stay no conflict for a decade, for 5 years, and then go back to the conflict. Okay, lapse it over. So once you are break it that way, you're creating a static factor on it. What I will is recommend it, make it out of one sample, create a dummy variable showing that is if it is post and pre, 0101, so that you're going to be relatively to the non-conflict country. What will happen if the country is in the conflict? What will happen to the sustainability? So create one big model. Unless you want to run a robust analysis, it might be worth it to run them at separate groups. But make sure, as I have said it, keep the same variable all over. Otherwise, you are just comparing apple and orange. But it's a very promising and very good work that you could continue for decades. And thank you.
Just one comment also to reflect on what Dr. Ayhab already said. First of all, yes, I also performed the test, the regression test on the wall group. It is, I think, if I can share my screen with you, I could show you with it. It is. So this is here. It is all countries. So I already performed this the regression analysis on the whole sample. With regard to the GMM, yes, I agree with you, as I told Dr. Ayhab. One point with regard to the consideration of a country, whether conflict, post-conflict, or non-conflict. Indeed, one country could be a conflict, so I consider the country, I consider the episodes, conflict episodes, but not the countries themselves. So a country could be included in the conflict group, and then the same country is included in the post-conflict group. So this allows me to observe the dynamics of the countries that are moving from conflict to post-conflict phase.
Thank you, Mohammad. I mean, these are great suggestions, to be honest. Like, all the comments are really amazing, and you can do a lot of work because, this is our job as economists. We listen to this broader perspective from amazing colleagues, like from different fields, and the challenge is how to empirically test these suggestions, right? I think you have a very powerful model, which is the fixed effect model. So, country fixed effect will absorb a lot of non-varying variables in the country. So this is speaking to Dr. Yazid's point. So you can use these arguments as well. I think the suggestion of Dr. Hamid is a really good one. I think this should be your model. You need a binary variable for countries that switch from conflict to post-conflict, and then you need to interact this binary model with the other variables in the same model. So here you will capture the effect of switching from conflict to post-conflict on physical sustainability, and also you will capture how the effect, for example, of FDI will change across these two groups. This should be like, where things, and of course, also the other technical points made by Dr. Hamid are also well taken. Do we have more questions? I just want to remind you that we have another session starting at 4:40. I think we have a few minutes here if we have more questions. Otherwise, I would like to thank Mohammad for this amazing presentation and paper. I would like to thank you all for being here and for the very engaging discussion. It's really an amazing session. And thank you very much for all of you. See you in 20 to 30 minutes. Hopefully.
Thank you all. Thanks.